Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. We're going to give it just a minute or so to go ahead and get started. We had over 1,000 people sign up to join the webinar. We know not all of them will be here. Some will be getting just the recording, but we want to give a chance for everybody to get logged in and ready to go. So again, welcome. You are in the right place. We're just going to give it a minute or so for everybody to get logged in. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Again, you're in the right place. We're going to give it about 1 more minute or less to make sure folks have a chance to get signed in. Thank you so much for being here for our webinar about Election Day 1 week later. Again, we'll just give it less than a minute before we get started to make sure folks have a chance to get signed in. Thanks for being here tonight. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Silva. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Vice President of Outreach at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. ASL interpretation is available. Our interpreter tonight is Patty. In the meeting controls toolbar along the bottom of your Zoom screen, click the interpretation icon, looks like a globe, to enable this feature. If you don't see it, you may need to update your Zoom client. It does only work in the app. It's not available in the browser. Closed captioning is available also on that menu bar by clicking the CC button. We're going to save some time at the end for audience questions. So if you do have a question at any time, again, along that menu bar of the Zoom screen, click the Q&A box. Go ahead and put your questions in there, and we will do our best to get to as many as we can. This webinar is being recorded, and all registrants will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording, as well as links to all the resources and toolkits discussed tonight. All right, so this webinar is a part of SRF365, a series of free year-round virtual programs that offer a taste of what attendees can expect at the annual Multi-Day Summit for Religious Freedom, spelled SRF, S-R-F. SRF365 amplifies and supplements the summit's content and creates a year-round hub for education, building power, networking, and taking action together. SRF is the hub for our collective fight for religious freedom, church-state separation, and the issues that depend on them, like LGBTQ rights, reproductive rights, protecting public schools, and more. SRF is convened by Americans United for Separation of Church and State, along with our collaborators and partners. Here's a quick video from SRF last year.
Come on,
Check this out.
check this out. Give me something new, something real cool, something that'll stick like super glue. Coming up next, we in the queue. You know who? Like a chef, we in the kitchen. We a genie granting wishes. We be savage, we be vicious. Got that magic, superstitious, yeah. I got a feeling and I just gotta say, this is better than good. Yeah, this is better than great. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I got a feeling things are going our way. You won't believe what you see, because it's all about to change. Bet you're wondering what it is. Bet you're asking how. In case you ain't convinced, come on, check this out. What?
SURF 2025 is being held April 5th through 7th in a new, larger venue. We sold out the last 2 years in the greater Washington, D.C. area, as well as virtually. It features a new organizational expo and a revamped Hill Day visiting Capitol Hill. Scholarships are available, and students with a .edu email address can attend virtually for free. Last year's keynote speakers included Anthea Butler and Representative Jamie Raskin. And you can find out more at www.thesurf.org. That's the SRF.org. All right. So again, thank you to Americans United for bringing this panel together tonight. AU is the only organization dedicated solely to defending the separation of church and state. We are the shield protecting the foundational American principle of freedom of religion, including the right to believe or not for all. We fight for freedom without favor and equality without exception. Now I'd like to bring our amazing group of panelists onto the screen. Welcome to the panel, Nick Nartowicz, Lead Policy Counsel at Americans United. Pooja Chaudhuri, Counsel at the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Eric Ward, Executive Vice President at Race Forward. And Anita Grabowski, the Campaign Director for Ballot Measure Strategy at the Planned Parenthood Action Fund. For those of you that have joined these panels before, we're running this a little differently. Each of our panelists is going to talk about a specific part of the campaign and elections, and then we'll bring everyone back together for Q&A. So for the first section, talking about elections and voting rights and voting accessibility, I'm going to turn it now over to Pooja from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law.
Thanks so much, Brian, and thanks for AU. Thanks to AU for having me. My name is Pooja, and I'm an attorney on the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. 95% of my work is to litigate various types of voting rights cases in federal and state courts across the country. And prior to this election, we brought and participated in probably more than 13 or 14 lawsuits related to the election itself. And so I'm here to tell you about the types of challenges that we saw that were geared towards undermining the election system and how we got through that, and how we're gearing up for the next 4 years. So the way that I think about it is that there were several attempts to undermine the system, and one of the buckets and categories were challenges brought mostly by private citizens and private parties against various states, essentially saying that the voting rolls in those states were inaccurate or ineligible, and requesting that the states very close to the election institute massive voter purges. So questioning the eligibility of voters and pushing states to purge these voters very close to an election was a tactic that we saw in Georgia, we saw it in Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Texas, and they didn't succeed because there are very strong federal protections, right? The federal National Voter Registration Act says that states cannot institute systematic voter purges within 90 days of a federal election. And many of these challenges were brought within that 90-day period. So the way that we sort of got involved there was to intervene on behalf of the states or the defendants in order to defend the sanctity of the rolls and stop the purges from happening. Another tactic that we saw was the same private parties in various states undermining the existing system by challenging what I would call the innocuous mechanics of the voting process. Now, what does that mean? So, for example, in Georgia, we saw a private plaintiff bring a lawsuit challenging multiple counties that right before the election had mailed out a lot of absentee ballots by the deadline and wanted to give voters additional time to come and return, hand deliver those ballots to the election boards. So what they did was they kept their election offices open during the weekend before election day and Monday before election day. And they had been doing that for many years. And so to the layperson, that sounds fine, right? You keep the offices open right before election day so voters can come and hand deliver their absentee ballots. That rule was challenged in court as a violation of state statute and as unconstitutional under the federal constitution. And we got involved as an amicus in that case. And ultimately, the judge said, no way, this is not a case that can survive. These claims are frivolous and, I'm going to get rid of them. You might have also heard or seen a lot of news articles on what was happening in Pennsylvania. A similar issue, their private plaintiffs similarly brought lawsuits that said that counties that were allowing voters to vote provisionally, voters who had cast absentee ballots that were, for whatever reason, rejected for being defective. For example, if a voter forgot to sign it or forgot to date it correctly, then an absentee ballot may have been thrown out. So many counties in Pennsylvania were allowing voters to use the provisional ballot process to cast ballots that would then count. That was challenged as an extension of authority, of legislative authority, a violation of state statute, and ultimately went up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. That the Supreme Court said it's fine, provisional voters should be able to cast these types of provisional ballots, and the law authorizes it. That was challenged to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court finally, said that we're going to defer to the state Supreme Court on this issue. So as you can see, there are multiple fronts that were being employed in order to test the systems. And in many of these situations, the systems did hold up, right? I mean, federal law was followed. Voters were able to cast their ballots. Voters were not purged, for example. Another front that we also were fighting on were states and counties themselves looking to use the system and disenfranchise voters. And one unfortunate situation occurred in Virginia, and right before the election, the Virginia Secretary of State had purged 1,600 voters who they claimed were non-citizens. Now, many of these voters were actually naturalized citizens, so they were able to vote, but they were purged off of the voter rolls. We challenged that in court, and that ultimately a federal court denied or granted the relief, and then that was appealed to higher up. It ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied the relief, so the Supreme Court stayed the case. And so ultimately Virginia was allowed to purge the 1,600 individuals. But we have a hotline that at the Lawyers Committee, the 866 Our Vote hotline, and many of these voters actually did call to the hotline, and we helped them register the same day, because Virginia has same-day registration, in order to then get registered and be able to vote on election day, despite the state's attempt to purge them. The other sort of front that we saw was in Georgia. We litigated a case where the Georgia State Election Board had passed a rule or a policy very close to the election that required and would require every county and every precinct to hand count ballots. Now, that is an extremely arduous process. You know, the rule was very complicated. And so in that situation, we filed a lawsuit there, and we were able to get relief from the court. So as you can see, that there are many different ways that, again, the system, as I said, was tested, and that ultimately that it survived. Now sort of we are in a new era and are anticipating similar challenges, more hostile courts, and are still developing our strategy as to how we are going to sort of defend the current laws that protect the right to vote, and affirmatively go after states and individuals that are trying to undermine the right to vote. And there's a lot of work to be done on that front. But I think that we have a playbook, and we know their playbook, and we can anticipate what might happen. And so we are actively gearing up on the legal front to undertake those challenges.
Thank you so much, Pooja. And I know that folks are going to be interested to hear during the Q&A, what other new novel challenges folks we might be looking to see, and what people can continue to do about it. So thank you. Just as a reminder, folks, the chat you can use if you're having any technical issues, and we'll try to help, but we are not pulling questions from there. So if you have a question in there, it won't be answered. So please use the Q&A function. Now turning it over to Nick Nartowicz. As you know, public education, especially vouchers, is a key part of the portfolio that we work on at Americans United because of its close correlation to religious freedom. And there was a lot going on this election season with vouchers. So Nick's going to talk about what those were, how they came to be, what happened on election night, and what hope and also what concern we have looking forward. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Brian. So it's not often that when you do work in state legislatures on church-state separation that you're able to bring good news. But in the voucher space, we actually did have a lot of really good news this year, specifically around 3 ballot initiatives that happened in Colorado, Nebraska, and Kentucky. So I'll start with Colorado's. There were a group in Colorado got enough signatures to put on the ballot a question about school choice. School choice is a term that pro-voucher groups use. And they do that because, they talk about the fact that choice is good and gives you options. It also encompasses a lot of other things besides vouchers. There are ideas like open public school enrollment and homeschooling. So there's a lot under the umbrella of school choice, but more often than not, when people are talking about school choice, they're talking about vouchers as an option. So specifically, the group that got this ballot initiative there wanted to put language in, and they claimed that it was about protecting charter schools, which also falls under that umbrella of school choice, depending on how broadly you define it. And it basically just would have given the right to school choice to people in Colorado, and it defined that pretty broadly. In order to pass, that ballot initiative needed 55% of voters voting in favor of it. And luckily, there was a great coalition in the state that, including the teachers union, as well as a number of other groups that organized the opposition and really got the word out that although the one side was selling this as protecting charter schools, the charter schools are already protected under state law and have existed in Colorado since the 90s, but that what this really would allow is private school vouchers. Because the language was so broad, it could have even kind of mandated that vouchers exist, which they don't exist in the state right now. So they got the word out, did a kind of Herculean effort, and that was actually voted down. Only 48% of people voted in favor of the amendment. And like I said, it needed 55. So it lost not only under the threshold that it needed, but lost by 7% of what it needed. The next one that I'm going to talk about is in Nebraska. So for those of you who pay close attention to voucher work or the work that AU does, you might know that last year, Nebraska passed its first voucher program through the legislature. And pro-public school groups in that state got the effort out and collected enough signatures to get that issue on the ballot. Nebraska, as you may or may not know, is a unicameral legislature, and the ballot initiative process is known as kind of the second chamber, the way that people get to respond to bills passed by the legislature. So last year, again, this is in 2023, they collected enough signatures. They needed, I think, 60 or 70,000 signatures. They collected enough to get the issue on the ballot last year. Or I'm sorry, so it would have been on the ballot for this year. Then in this earlier this year, the state legislature repealed the bill they passed last year and passed a new one that created a different funding mechanism for that voucher. The purpose of that being to make it harder for this to go to the voters. They did not want this issue to go to the voters because they knew that they would lose. So what that meant was that the people who wanted to protect public schools had to start the process all over again and had actually even fewer days to collect the required number of signatures. But they, again, got that done. So in 2 years, they collected enough signatures to put this issue on the ballot twice. And it was indeed on the ballot this year. And the repeal passed with 57% of the vote. So again, it just needed a simple majority. 57% of people voted to repeal that bill, which would have allocated $10 million a year to the program. That is great news, the fact they were able to do this twice and able to stop this bill in its tracks. That was, again, after not only was there the legislative effort to repeal it, but they also tried to challenge it at the Secretary of State's process. They basically, the pro-voucher people threw up every roadblock they could, and voters and people who support public schools still managed to repeal that bill, which is great news. But the biggest success in my mind is actually what happened in Kentucky. So in 2022, the Kentucky legislature enacted a private school voucher bill. That bill was challenged by people who, again, support public schools as violating the state constitution. The state has a constitutional provision that prohibits public funding from going to private schools. So that bill was challenged under that provision. It went up to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court struck down the program. Of course, the pro-voucher people couldn't have that. So they got the legislature to pass a constitutional amendment that would have allowed public funding to go to private schools. Pro-voucher groups spent more than $16 million in the state to try to get this to pass. They have been giving money into that state from out of state for over a year now. And they have just been pouring so much money into that state, and the pro-public school groups just could not match that. But again, they are dedicated, they're hardworking, they got the word out, and 65% of voters in the state rejected efforts to amend the Constitution. It lost 65% voted against it, only 35% voted in favor of it. That's a 30-point loss for private school vouchers. And I will remind you, the state of Kentucky, that otherwise voted extremely, extremely red. Vouchers lost in every single county in the state. That also actually happened in Nebraska. Every single county in Nebraska voted down or voted to repeal the voucher bill. So that is 2 states that otherwise people consider to be extremely Republican, extremely red, extremely conservative, all voting down vouchers, which doesn't really match with the rhetoric coming from state legislators on this. They are often talking about, well, state and federal legislators, actually. They're often talking about how parents are clamoring for this. They're demanding it, that this is the fix to public schools. And it is extremely clear from these votes that this is not what people actually want. A really important and fun statistic is that before the election night this year, vouchers have been on the ballot 14 times and they lost all 14. And now that number is 17 of 17 times. Every time vouchers have been on a ballot in a state, they have lost. Voters are repeatedly signaling that they do not want vouchers and that's not what they want for their public schools in states that are, again, are extremely red states, extremely blue states. This is a universal thing that we're seeing, that voters do not want vouchers. Unfortunately, the reality is we will see more efforts to enact vouchers next year. The Texas legislature tried to pass a voucher bill in 2023. They are back in session next year. And unfortunately, the Republican governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, actually primaried some Republicans who were opposed to vouchers. And so it looks like he will have the numbers to potentially pass a program next year. We're still not sure what that's going to look like, but that will be a big fight. And in Tennessee as well, Governor Lee has promised to try to enact a voucher or expand a voucher program there. Excuse me, they already have a voucher program. They tried to do that this year and it again failed. But these votes and these extreme numbers are a really big signal to legislators that vouchers are not what people actually want. So with that, I will pass it back to Brian.
Thanks, Nick. Before you go, we're getting a lot of folks ask. First of all, a lot of folks are mentioning how great it is to hear the wins. So the wins, stopping, the voter suppression. We just talked about these voucher wins. And it is important we talk about those because I know folks are feeling really, really down about the big marquee races, but it is all of these things. And it's important to remember that there were a lot of wins. And what that means is that there's a lot that we can learn and take away. So before we pass it over, and actually it's good to have the three of us on because we're all talking about ballot measures, and along with Anita. If you had to say what's one thing that you're taking away from those wins that you feel that you can use or others can use, going forward to continue to push back against, not just vouchers, but other kind of, right-wing Christian nationalist attempts to do stuff. What would that be for folks?
Yeah, I would say I think the biggest message is you have to do the work of getting out there and explaining it to people, right? Like whether it is in Colorado where they had to explain what the actual language meant because it was being sold as, oh, we just want to protect charter schools, or in Nebraska where they had to do it twice in 2 years and people are going to say, why am I signing this again? Didn't I just do this last year? Or in Kentucky, right? Understanding what it's actually about and why they should care about vouchers. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of effort, but it also takes the right messenger, right? So in Kentucky, I know they focused on highlighting in-state voices, highlighting the voices of teachers, highlighting the voices of parents who had kids in those public schools that would lose out, highlighting the voices of people from rural communities whose schools are going to suffer the most, highlighting the voices of parents of students with disabilities who will not be able to use a voucher because their private schools will probably turn their kid away or expel them if they find that they can't actually educate them. So they had to do a lot of work of actually getting out, doing the work on the ground, but finding the right messengers to convey those stories and make people understand what the actual issue is.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate that. Anita, that's so important. I'm guessing also that you learned in all of the abortion ballot measures that you're going to talk about, the messenger matters, even if other messengers have big hearts, they might not be the right voice. So I will turn it over to you to talk about what happened with reproductive rights and abortion on the ballot, and also what we learned can take going forward.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian, and thanks for having me. So as Brian mentioned early on, my name is Anita Grabowski. I'm the campaign director for ballot initiative strategy at Planned Parenthood Action Fund, and I use she, her pronouns. So I want to walk you through, we had a couple goals this cycle. I'm going to walk you through what those were, a little bit of the landscape where we ended up and some of the successes and narrow defeats, but also really focusing on the takeaways and where do we go from here. So as we entered this cycle, we have a multi-cycle approach to looking at restoring, protecting, and expanding abortion access state by state in this post-Roe world. And we know that direct democracy is one of our best avenues to do that, especially in states that have hostile legislatures. So our goals this year, one, were to use direct democracy to preserve access to care in vulnerable places. So that's like states like Montana, right, where they have a Supreme Court ruling that had shot down some of their abortion restrictions, but it's a very politically hostile state. And if we lose the Supreme Court, we could lose abortion access. So protecting access in vulnerable places. Second goal was restoring access where there were already devastating bans in place, places like Florida, Arizona, Missouri. And then thirdly, really looking for opportunities in states where we have political momentum to expand access to care. So those were states like Maryland, Colorado, Nevada, and New York. I'm going to talk about each of those a little bit. So as you know, as you have seen, right, we ran as Planned Parenthood with our coalition and ballot committee partners. We supported 9 of the reproductive health ballot measures that were on the ballot this cycle, and we won big despite the catastrophic losses overall. We won 7 of the 9, and where we had defeats, there were some extenuating circumstances, and I'll talk about Florida and Nebraska in particular in a minute. But in terms of our wins, voters in Arizona approved Prop 139 by 61.6%, which is just phenomenal. And the state had a 15-week abortion ban that was overturned. So the fundamental right to abortion is now in their state constitution. Similarly, in Missouri, voters approved Amendment 3 by 51.6%. Again, for a state that went overwhelmingly for Trump, this now enshrines the right to make reproductive health decisions, including abortion, birth control, miscarriage care in the state constitution. And that is a state that had a total abortion ban. So it's the first one that has done away with a total ban. What we saw happen in Colorado, again, huge approval numbers, 61.9%, enshrine the right to abortion, and also voted to repeal the ban on state insurance coverage for abortion. So that's a big fight around public funding, people who are on state insurance programs and Medicaid programs. In Maryland, we saw the voters there overwhelmingly. 75% of voters voted to establish the right to reproductive freedom in their state constitution. Montana, they won by 57.6% to protect the right to make decisions about pregnancy, including abortion, in their constitution. Nevada, we also won by 64%. This is one that will protect abortion rights in their constitution, and it needs to go to voters one more time in 2026 before it gets ratified. So great victory for this cycle, one more step to go. And then in New York, this was a really special ballot initiative. It was an equal rights amendment, an expanded equal rights amendment, and we won by 61.9% of the vote. This is interesting because it sets up a new legal framework for defending pregnancy decisions, including abortion and birth control, miscarriage care, etc., within a rights framework. So it expands the anti-discrimination protections already in the existing state constitution. And we also, in New York, enshrined anti-discrimination protections for transgender people, as well as people with disabilities, protections for discrimination based on age, as well as national origin. So again, a really innovative and kind of first of its kind measure that we passed in New York. In terms of the ones that failed, Florida, Amendment 4, would have brought an end to the 6-week ban, which has had just devastating consequences in Florida. The majority of Floridians, 57%, voted for the measure. In any other campaign, that would be a landslide victory. However, voters are disenfranchised by the state's supermajority requirement, which requires 60% of voters to amend the Constitution. So we narrowly failed there. So it makes the loss even more bitter. And then Nebraska also narrowly failed to pass a ballot measure that would expand abortion access, and instead a competing measure that was designed to confuse voters passed. And that measure actually enshrines the existing 12-week ban in the state constitution. So it restricts abortions after the first trimester. So abortion remains banned in Nebraska. And that was the first state. In some of the takeaways, we see this new strategy where the opposition is contemplating filing countermeasures in order to purposely confuse and divide voters. And then finally, there was a measure on the ballot in South Dakota as well that would have potentially allowed some abortion access in the first trimester. This is one that Planned Parenthood did not get involved in. It did not pass, and South Dakota's ban remains in place. So mixed bag, but overall, really in terms of top takeaways, we saw that voters spoke very clearly that at no point in pregnancy is a politician or the government more qualified to make personal healthcare decisions than a patient and their doctor. And fundamentally, people want the government out of their personal business. So when given the chance, voters really seize that opportunity to reject the abortion bans and to protect their reproductive freedom for now and for future generations. So, there was a lot of momentum, but what we're learning in the course of these campaigns is that as our approach is getting more sophisticated, so is the opposition's. And so I wanted to highlight a few of the things that we saw from their playbook and then start to talk about where do we go from here. So, we saw unprecedented opposition spending. We saw the use of state resources to try to thwart the abortion access ballot measures. So in Florida, DeSantis tried to block Amendment 4 by using the state police force to intimidate petition signers. He was utilizing a state agency's website to spread misinformation, and he was using taxpayer money to fund ads that would defeat the measure. So using state resources and positions of power to try to block these measures was something we had not seen in previous cycles. We also saw ongoing attempts by Republican lawmakers to enact anti-democratic rules to make the signature gathering process more difficult, for example, or to change the threshold. Other states are going to try to change their threshold to 60%, like Florida has already done. and just an onslaught of misinformation, scare tactics, racist and anti-trans rhetoric to dissuade voters from approving these measures. In New York, for example, because it was an expanded ERA that does protect trans rights and that does give some protection from discrimination, regardless of your national origin, the opposition in the last 2 weeks of the campaign dropped almost $8 million into anti-immigrant and anti-trans ads in order to try to thwart the ballot measure. But it didn't work, luckily, and voters saw through that. But that type of fear-mongering and misinformation is going to be even more amplified, we think, in the new administration. And then, as I mentioned already, in Nebraska, we saw the countermeasure that played out. Republican lawmakers were also contemplating that tactic in Arizona and Florida, and ultimately failed to align on a policy to move that forward. But we do anticipate they're going to try to do countermeasures in the future where we also introduce proactive measures. And, despite all of this, we know that voters came together across party lines and across other differences, urban-rural divides, religious versus non-religious, Republican versus Democrat versus independent, to support abortion rights. So in terms of where do we go from here, there's a couple things I want to highlight. One is that there's still a long road ahead for implementation. So in these states, oftentimes we need to litigate to remove existing bans and existing restrictions on abortion. And so being involved both in the grassroots legislative process in your state can be really helpful. And I think Brian or David is going to drop some resources in the chat. But one of the links that I provided is that you can find your local Planned Parenthood political and advocacy organization to sign up to get involved in the fights ahead. We're going to need you during legislative session also, because we expect to see increased attacks on the direct democracy process itself. And so trying to kill those bills at the legislative level is going to be much more effective than if some of those may go to a ballot campaign in and of themselves and go directly to the voters about changing signature collection processes or changing the threshold for voting on ballot measures. So, helping to make sure that you're there, standing up for implementation, fighting in the legislature is going to be really important. And then secondly, we have to be vigilant about the attacks on reproductive health and rights that'll surely come in the next Trump administration. So the voters who affirmatively chose abortion access, despite voting for Trump, and I do not understand that cognitive dissonance among those voters, they are going to be a key constituency among this next administration, because while Trump has said again and again that he would not support a national abortion ban, and in fact poured $20 million into an ad buy in the last week or so of his election saying he will not ban abortion, we need to hold him to it, because we know that there's a lot of pressures right now on the Trump administration by the anti-abortion movement to do everything they can to restrict abortion and defund Planned Parenthood. So staying vigilant and being part of those federal advocacy efforts is going to be really important. So the other link that I've provided is you can sign up to be a Planned Parenthood Action Fund member, so you'll get our updates. We always need people to be sharing their stories. You don't have to have an abortion story to have a story about why access to reproductive health care is important to you and those you love. And then signing our petition to continue the fight for reproductive freedom. So really hope you can stay involved in those ways, and happy to answer any questions you have. It was very heartening to see that people care about bodily autonomy and reproductive freedom, but really disheartening that at the same time, they would not vote for the candidate that represented those values as well. So we have a long road ahead, some bright spots in the night sky, and look forward to working with you all on these fights as we go into the next couple of years.
Thanks, Anita. Just to continue with our theme of the path forward and what we're learning and how we can use it, one thing that I've heard across all of the speakers so far is process matters. Pooja was talking about, there's this little known board in Georgia that was, had some folks that were appointed to it trying to mess with all of the election rules, and they were held to account and overturned. There's states that were trying to change the ballot measure process to make it 60%, and those things matter because we passed all these abortion bans because, we kept that. As Nick said, the Nebraska legislature tried to repass, a new ballot measure. So those things are not the most attractive and sexy. They're not the 4 years, presidential campaign. But I think one of the things we see with the path forward is we have to keep showing up, and we have to keep showing up in the things that might seem mundane, but actually have a giant bearing on the process. And the other thing I think, as you said, both you and Nick said, is that lots of folks voted to pass abortion and then also voted for the person who said that they're going to do all these other things. So there are places where we can talk to people across divide. And I think it lends this some credibility to having conversations where we can come to agreement even without everything, and protecting things that we have and moving forward in places that we can, and that it is not all lost. It is not hopeless for the next 4 years. There are people and places and conversations that can be had. And I think, Eric, that's a great transition over to you, because I know so much of the work you've done is about people having conversations. And again, we've seen this leading up to it: white Christian nationalism, religious extremism, political extremism. What did we see on the campaign? What did we see on election day? And most importantly, what's the way forward for folks?
Absolutely. And hello, everyone. I'm so grateful to SRF and Americans United for gathering us here today. Again, my name is Eric Ward, and I'm the Executive Vice President of Race Forward. And at Race Forward, we're committed to advancing racial justice and equity in every part of American life. Our work includes programs like HEAL, Honest Education, Action, and Leadership Together, where we support students, educators, and parents in advocating for an honest, fully funded public education. Programs like HEAL and others at Race Forward are about building that inclusive democracy where every voice and history is valued. And I know many of us are coming together today with heavy hearts. It's a week after the elections. The disappointment, anger, and fear are real. We need to give ourselves room to feel that weight, not as a weakness, but as an honor to the work we poured into building an America where everyone belongs. Tonight, I want to talk to you about how we move forward as leaders. As much as we're hurting, our purpose calls us forward. And our democracy, I believe, needs us more than ever. The election outcome feels devastating, yes, but I want to be clear. It wasn't a wholesale defeat of inclusive democracy. Instead, it was also calculated undermining. In many cases, voter suppression tactics, biased redistricting, and targeted misinformation, especially on social media platforms controlled by influential figures like Elon Musk, had a hand in distorting the outcome. States like Georgia implemented stricter voting measures that reduced access, especially in predominantly Black communities. Partisan redistricting had skewed representation further, with Republican-led legislators crafting maps heavily favoring their party. And the misinformation on social media, including those posts by Elon Musk, amassed over 2 billion views this election season, fueling public confusion and distrust. This wasn't a full reflection of Americans' will. Rather, it also revealed the links to which some will go to co-opt and suppress voices of fairness and equality. I think it's important to remember this. The vision of an inclusive democracy still holds the support of many Americans in this country. This election result reflects systemic efforts to distort and silence that support. It is not the end of the fight for a just democracy. This election also highlights significant power amassed by right-wing extremists who have co-opted and politicized Christianity. Exit polls show about 71% of Protestant Christians supported Donald Trump at this election season. This underscores just how much influence religious identity holds in today's choices. Recent surveys also revealed that around 55% of Republicans now align with these politicized religious views, reflecting deep ideological shifts. These movements are rooted in an exclusive, not inclusive, vision of America. They challenge voting rights, restrict reproductive freedoms, and target policies that protect the most vulnerable among us. And there were even warnings of extremist violence before the election cycle, during the election cycle, and now post-election cycle. This reinforces how real the threats are. These movements reveal the risk of exclusion and division. But in the face of this, I want those on this call to remember there are counter narratives and forces working to build inclusion, fairness, and the resilience that we want. As was mentioned, these places are like Colorado and Michigan, for instance, where a majority of voters stood by candidates committed to fair voting and reproductive freedom. In Michigan, a surge in young, diverse voters played a pivotal role in upholding these values as well. And as spoken about, Colorado, that powerful coalition of faith leaders and community activists countered the exclusionary rhetoric by focusing on unity and shared well-being, a message that resonated deeply with voters. And in Georgia, despite targeted voter suppression efforts, turnout among historically marginalized communities remained strong. These voters knew what they were up against, that there were forces that want to exclude them, and many of them showed up anyway. This is a testament to the power of grassroots organizing and the resilience of communities to stand firm for justice. These examples remind us that our country is not wholly engulfed by extremism. Many Americans still believe in democracy that includes everyone, that protects the vulnerable, and values justice over division. It's these pockets of hope that can ground us in what's possible, providing us with models of resilience we can build on. These stories tell us that inclusive democracy can survive, even thrive in the face of significant opposition. In moments like this, we must remember we are part of a lineage of resilience. Those who came before us also faced setbacks, often against seemingly impossible odds, yet they pressed on. The legacy of courage belongs to us now, and no election outcome can take that away. We honor this legacy by choosing courage, unity, and action over despair and cynicism. I want to give you 3 calls to action as leaders. Ground yourself in these 3 ways to carry this legacy forward. First, hold each other close. Authoritarianism thrives when people feel isolated and powerless. So find your community, your organization, friends, families, or allies. Remind each other that we don't face this alone. Togetherness is an act of defiance in this moment. And when we're united, we are stronger than any force of extremism. Second, stand in truth. Lies and information thrive in chaos. Your voice can be a steady anchor. Each time we speak up for honesty and respect, countering misinformation, or insist on the truth, we shield ourselves and others from manipulation. The truth telling is our shield against division. Let's wield it with courage and humility. 3, build where you are. Change will start locally in this moment. Look around your community. Who's advocating for justice, inclusion, and truth? Support them. Volunteer. Attend a meeting. Speak up for policies that reflect our shared values. These small acts will ripple outward, inspiring others to join us in creating that fairer society. So I want you to hold this in your heart. We are not defeated. This outcome is not the end of the journey for an America where everyone belongs. Our setbacks do not define us. Our response does. History is full of those who faced down darkness, who stood firm, who fought for something bigger than themselves. Now we are that history. We are that resilience. Each of you, each community fighting for inclusion and truth. You are the heartbeat of democracy in this moment. Every step you take to connect, to uplift truth, to build keeps democracy alive. I believe together we can create a world where difference is celebrated, where justice flows, and where every voice has a place. And there will continue to be obstacles, but we know that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is the power to stand in that fear, to look it in the eyes and say, not here, not now, not ever. So in closing, here's what I want you to know. Let's walk forward with unbreakable purpose. We won't face this alone. We will hold each other close. We will keep that truth alive. We will keep building. This right here is how we win. Not by yielding to fear, but by rising with strength and with hope. Understand more than ever, this is our time.
Thank you, Eric. I think those words of inspiration and also really concrete marching orders. It is local, and finding something that is near you to get involved with is critical and key. We're going to bring all of our panelists back on, and we're going to dive into the questions. We'll probably go a few minutes over. I know there was a lot that we covered tonight, so I appreciate everyone sticking with us. We have been here. We did make it through a first Trump administration, and I think it's important for folks to remember that. And we started that without the infrastructure that we built up now, and I think that is also an important thing to remember. So thank you, everybody. So the first question is from Helen. Pretty sure I know the answer, but I think it's a really critical one. Would a federal abortion ban override all of the state laws that allow abortion? And correct me if I'm wrong, but that is a yes, right, Anita?
Yes, that is my understanding.
Yeah. So
that's why
I think
so important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things that folks have been asking about, and I think this is the part about paying attention to the things that are somewhat mundane. So a few months ago, there was a bill proposed in the House. It was an IRS bill that was supposed to help families, folks who were being held by terrorist organizations abroad. And it was to stop the IRS from imposing fines on them for missing filing their taxes. And just, I think today, or just within a few days ago, an amendment was added to it that would give the Treasury Secretary the ability to strip the nonprofit status of any 501c3 nonprofit like AU, like Planned Parenthood, like Lawyers Committee, like Race Forward, if they felt, with no proof whatsoever, but they felt that they were somehow supporting terrorist organizations. That's the part how democracy dies. And I know a lot of folks were making calls today to try to stop that. I don't know where exactly that happened, but I know we're staying vigilant on it. I know lots of folks are. It would still have to pass the Senate, even if it went there. But those are the things I think, for things marching forward, those are the little things that we're going to have to stay really vigilant to, and listen to organizations like those here who are going to send out those calls to action. We posted on social media, for folks to make phone calls, as well as many others. So, Nick, who are the private parties that? Pooja, who are the private parties that brought the lawsuits challenging the voter rolls and the election procedures?
So one was United Sovereign Americans. There were Americans Defending Freedom. There's a whole host of organizations that have cropped up that that bring these types of lawsuits. including some private voters as well, because a lot of states have laws that allow private citizens to challenge voter eligibility.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that. So we have a couple of folks asking about North Carolina. Robin has asked about that for one. Any comment on the election in North Carolina for superintendent of schools, where the anti-public school candidate lost? I'll just say one thing and then I'll hand it to Nick if you want to say anything. These are the wins. Like, these are part of the reason why we wanted to come together tonight, was to talk about the wins. And I say this not from a perspective as a Democrat or Republican. AU is a nonpartisan organization. But in a state where at the top of the ticket, it went one direction, at the state level, it went the other. And that person has control over the public education system. So there was a conversation, people were able to hold those two things in their head, crazy as it may seem. But Nick, any thought on, North Carolina and what that means for any potential, voucher measures in that state, at least for the next few years?
Yeah, unfortunately, while it is good news that person lost, it does not actually have an impact on vouchers. There was actually a news article earlier today that because North Carolina looks to have lost its supermajority in the state legislature, which also is great news with a newly elected Democratic governor and a current Democratic governor, that while they have that supermajority to override vetoes, they're going to override Governor Cooper's veto of a HB 10, which is a large funding bill, but included, I forget exactly how many millions of dollars for private school vouchers, but a lot of millions of dollars for private school vouchers. So they're going to try to do that before they lose that supermajority, which is terrible news. But I know actually I saw a comment earlier from Pastor Suzanne. Hello, Pastor Suzanne, back. There's a group in North Carolina that we work with that is fighting that and trying to make sure that they can't do that, that veto can be sustained, but it is going to be a hard fight on that. But I think it does say a lot about what people actually think, right? Like people were talking about this earlier, but the kind of two positions in your mind that are different. I think we've seen a lot post-election of people who think, oh, they're not really going to do X, right? Like, not to get into too deep into the memes, but it's the leopard eating my face party. Like, they're not going to really do this. They're not going to really ban abortion. They're not going to really repeal the Affordable Care Act. So when people kind of have these individual votes, they actually, like on the Commissioner of Education, for example, they are voting that way, but the actual votes for Congress or for the president are about a lot of issues and what they think can really happen. I'd also note that that's not the only state where I think it's really a Moms for Liberty person lost in Florida. Florida had state board of election or school board votes earlier this year, and the Moms for Liberty candidates lost most of their races. It was not on election day; it was earlier before election day, but they lost most of their races. So it says a lot about what people actually care about. And the reality is that 90% of students in the country attend public schools. And while no one thinks that they are perfect, they are doing a great job at educating our kids, and people support them overwhelmingly.
Right. Cynthia is asking, obviously there's a lot of things that we need to do to be on the defense. It's just sort of the way that the system is set up for at least the short-term future. What are you recommending for folks that they can do on offense? I mean, I know, Eric, you really dug into it about, get involved locally, but just want to pass the hat around and ask for folks, what can people do proactively that's not just being reactive?
Yeah, I could say from,
I'm going to let.
Oh, go ahead, Anita.
Okay, sorry, it's breaking up for me, so tell me if I'm choppy. From Planned Parenthood's perspective, I would say, even in some of the more politically challenging states, really supporting measures that people can agree on, like reducing maternal mortality rates, particularly among women of color and Black women who experience the highest rates of maternal mortality. So there's legislation that we can pass, so staying involved in the advocacy efforts to address maternal mortality, to address just the of healthcare access for funding for preventative care around breast cancer and cervical cancer screenings. There's a whole range of sexual and reproductive healthcare that Planned Parenthood provides that's very critical in our communities, that doesn't have anything to do with, the broader range of abortion attacks that are happening. So staying involved and making sure that we have the funding and the access to address those issues would be really important.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Look, what we know are that civil society is going to come under attack. Um, Labor unions. There will be further pushes to restrict uh, reproductive rights and women's health choices. At the end of the day, the attacks will be many, and there'll be a lot of testing of the water. There'll be lots of attempts to try to exhaust us. And the one thing that I tell folks is you don't have to take on every fight in this moment, but you have to take on one of them, whether it's the attack on public education or women's health or immigration or equity in American society, climate. The list goes on. And the best way you can do that is by being in an organization and really focusing. In terms of policy advocacy, it is a time to reject the jack of all trades, right? It is time to really pick a handful of issues that you will focus in on in terms of policy. In terms of solidarity, though, it has to be broader. You have to show up for the broad array of organizations and communities that will find themselves under attack. We have to close ranks and to understand that the incoming administration has threatened a litigation, politicizing the Department of Justice, and a host of other measures. Now, whether that was just campaign rhetoric remains to be seen, and many organizations are monitoring in real time to understand what will become administrative policy versus that political rhetoric. But those of us on this call, we will be ineffective unless we place ourselves in organization. So I'll make it very clear. There'll be lots of policies to focus on. But your job over this week is to be in organization, to find an organization that you can join locally and nationally so that you are part of the larger movement to defend inclusive democracy.
And I'll briefly add some very, concrete specifics because my practice is so focused on just litigating. But one thing that would be helpful, I think, if you feel like, as Eric said, elections are your thing and you want to work in that area, is to train to be a poll worker, because in all the different states there are a lack of poll workers. And so going through that process, contacting your county board of elections, asking them, hey, how can I serve as a poll worker in the next election? That would be great, right? And the other thing is, every state has multiple coalitions that work on elections. And so one of the ways that they're connected is through the election protection program. And every election cycle, we have volunteers, regular individuals who get trained in order to monitor the polling places and collect information and gather data as to how the election process is panning out. So if you are interested in that, then look at 866-R-VOTE, and I will send that information to Brian to then circulate to everybody. And please get involved in election monitoring.
I will do two more short questions. The first one for you, Eric. We had a number of folks say, how did Christian nationalism rear its head in the elections? Can you share? I mean, I think there's a lot of examples, but are there like a couple of examples that really stick out in your head where that ideology and that movement really, I don't know, was just really visible and really maybe even had more impact than in other ways?
Yes, I mean, the most significant way that it had an impact, of course, was through voter mobilization. So what we know in this period is that the outcome of this election, right, in a nonpartisan way, wasn't just a shift in votes. It was, in fact, that the Trump campaign effectively, or at least it appears, right, through exit polling data and voter surveys, was able to increase the white vote. And that white vote was largely driven by the message of white Christian nationalism, and it played out significantly. The issue that was used in terms of doing that was attacks on the LGBTQ community, particularly the trans community. It was a motivator nationally, and I think we will see that it also played a role in specific states. I think it'll be 2 or 3 months until we see that data, but I think we will see that. The pressure to distance ourselves from that vulnerable community was significant. And I'm really proud that some elected officials chose not to distance themselves, to not break ranks, to not leave any of us vulnerable, but it certainly did. I think one of the ways to understand, at least again, in initial exit polling, I want to caution folks, as many of us know, exit polling can vary substantially from what we will see in final numbers. But voting patterns amongst Christian voters varied significantly across racial, ethnic, and gender lines. And white evangelical Christians, as I said, continued to show strong support for Donald Trump, uh, um, uh, with approximately, in a new poll out of Baptist News, 82% there saying voted for him. I think that'll be closer to 79, but that's an increase from 2020. White Catholics support for Trump rose to 61%, up from 56% in 2020. Black Protestants, the majority of Black Protestants voters supported Kamala Harris, notably 78% of Black men, right, 92% of Black women, indicating strong support for inclusive democracy amongst Black Christians. We can also get into gender differences amongst Christian voters. Overall, male Christian voters showed a tendency to support Trump, for instance. Among white evangelical men, Trump's support for Trump was particularly strong. And female Christian voters displayed more varied preferences. While white evangelical women largely supported Trump, I think it's important to note that Black Christian women overwhelmingly voted for Harris. These patterns highlight the complex interplay of race, ethnicity, and gender in shaping the political preference of Christian voters in 2024. Moving forward, the challenge will be for the rest of us to not place evangelical voters, Christian voters into boxes, but to actually understand there is much movement within that community, and we need to be engaging it and empowering those who really lean into the philosophy that this is a society where we can all move forward together.
Right. Well, I really appreciate that. And I think that that's actually a great note to end on. And I know we've gone a few minutes over. So I want to thank our panelists, Nick from Americans United, Pooja from Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, Eric from Race Forward, and Anita from Planned Parenthood Action Fund. As a reminder, the webinar was recorded and all the registrants will receive an email tomorrow with the link, as well as link to all of the resources that came up in the conversation and chat. And if you like what you heard, I hope you'll join us at our next SRF365 webinar this spring, and then consider joining us in person or virtually at our 2025 Summit for Religious Freedom, being held April 5th through 7th in the greater Washington, D.C. area and virtually. Join our collective fight for all the issues we discussed tonight and more. Visit www.thesrf for more information. Thank you all so much. Have a great night.